Let me start by thanking His All Holiness and luminaries with him for this opportunity, for setting up this meeting and coming to Louisiana and bringing as much attention to our issues as they have. Before I start, just to kind of set the stage, I did my graduate studies here in Louisiana. I left for about 8 years, and I came back in 1991, and a year later Hurricane Andrew hit, and it hit Louisiana in the absolute best place that a hurricane could hit, and we saw minimal impacts because it was an area with very healthy wetlands. But at that point in time, I realized that if that storm had been just a few degrees slightly different in its track, it would have hit New Orleans, and it would have had serious consequences. In the mid-1990s, I was asked by the then governor to run the state coastal restoration program. So I was the coastal czar. I had lots of authority. And what I realized after 2 years was politically, we weren't going to get any serious coastal restoration done before a major storm hit. In the 1999, I managed to convince the university to let us start a hurricane center. And in 2002, we got a major grant to look at New Orleans. So we focused on New Orleans in terms of what would the impacts be of a major storm. And that included developing many tools. Right after Katrina, because we had some of those tools, I went to the governor and I told her there's too much water in New Orleans for this to have been an act of God. And Governor Blanco's response was, go find out. The net result was about a couple of months later, I was asked by the state of Louisiana to set up a team to do a forensic investigation. And in fact, we were the first to put out there that we thought this had been a catastrophic structural failure. Now, I'm going to look a little bit first at Africa, and then I'm going to come back to Katrina, because there's a big global warming issue that I don't think has really been looked at very seriously. Now, if we take the case of the United States, one of the models suggests, the upper panel, that it's going to get drier. We're going to have less rainfall. Another one of the models, the Hadley model, suggests it's going to be wetter. So what does that mean for the sediment in our rivers, so crucial for shaping the coast? Some rivers are going to have more sediment, some are going to have less, and what does this mean down at the bottom end? So I'm going to look at two situations, one where there was an abundance of sediment as a result of climate change, and one where there isn't. And I'm going to go to Mozambique, the Mozambique-Zululand coastal zone, coastal area, where we had a high sea level stand 5,000 years ago. It peaked at 4,840, and the height was 3.5 meters above present. And that signal has now been picked up in other parts of the world. And this was a case where we had a lot more cyclones. So we're going way down to southern Africa, and over here is an area called the Greater St. Lucia Wetlands Park, and it'll be one of the prime areas that I'll look at. But this whole coastal zone, from Mozambique to its southern end, has a series of big lakes on it. And two of the lakes are very shallow, and two of them are very deep. And I was asked in 1984 to develop a management plan for this area, and one of the things we needed to understand was how these systems had evolved. So I'm going to focus now a little bit on the Greater St. Lucia Wetland Park. It's an area that has the most hippos in the world and the most crocodiles. And as you can see from the lower left panel, they share the same habitat, and also, depending on whether it's a wet year or a dry year, has a very wide and ranging species of birds visiting the area, and now there are some of the big game established. So high about 5,000 years ago. In order to understand this, we did very detailed geophysical surveying. We went along and measured the depth of the sediment using sound waves. We did borings, carbon-14 dating, and what we see is that this lake consists of a drowned river valley, at least 40 meters deep, and we don't have data here, but it connects to a submarine canyon offshore, and that this was in fact a deep river valley from a previous very low sea level stand. If you go there now, you'll notice some of the features. This is a drought year, and you'll see there's no water. It's all mud. And the hippos and crocs sort of congregate in tiny little mud holes like this one over here. But also you'll see these ridges here, and these are old beach ridges and this sand area that goes across the lake. So something must have been going on here that had very high wave energy and was introducing coarse beach sand. If we look at the sediment in the lake, and I'll draw your attention to the panel number 3, you will notice that from about the 30-meter mark up to the present, it filled in over the space of that time when we had this high sea level stand. So where did this sediment come from? The actual catchments for the present day system are very small, and as the red line shows, most of it receives less than 20 inches per year, hence the reason for the frequent droughts. However, Cyclone Des Moines hit this area in 1984, and in the space of 24 hours on one of the river basins deposited 80 million cubic meters of sediment, these flash floods. And I then went through the missionary records at some of the mission stations in Zululand. I've been there for many, many years since the British first arrived in the mid-1800s. And it looked like about once every 30 years we would get these cyclones coming through, and they were mostly rainfall events, with Cyclone Des Moines, 40 inches of rain in 24 hours. So what we've been able to show is that at that time of highly sea level stand, the ocean was much warmer. We know that because there were corals in this area where there aren't corals now. The inhabitants, the early Bantu, left. It was no longer habitable for them, although in essence these cyclone pulses were building deltas into a big ancestral lake. And the net result is we end up with this system that is now only 2 meters deep. A little further up the coast is one of the bays, the lakes that during this time period received very little sediment. Lake Sabai. It's still as deep now as it was 18,000, in terms of water depth, as deep as it was 5,000 years ago. And there's been some very interesting changes. It's now sealed from the sea. It still has marine invertebrates and vertebrates living in it, and there is an endemic fish that occurs only in the world. So very rapid adaptation, if you will, of this environment to change. But again, it was cut off, even though it was experiencing the cyclone rainfalls, it was cut off from major sediment sources. I'm going to switch gear. That's what happens, if you will, high sea level stand. You move the cyclone zone south in southern hemisphere, and you can very significantly change the environment. And that has potential implications for many other systems where perhaps we increase the sediment supply. With Katrina, it's a little different. But before I go there, I want to talk about what's at stake, because I think it's very important to frame this, and Jerry did a good job, and others have done it. Oil and gas, biggest port in the US, some would say the world, fisheries, wildlife, culture, and also what's at stake, I think very importantly, is national pride. The little red dots are producing oil and gas wells in these parishes, and you can see the whole coastal zone is dotted with production facilities. This is just the mouth of the river, and you can see the mass of pipelines, the purple and pink and blue lines coming in from offshore. Most of the offshore oil and gas in the United States is produced off Louisiana, and the little E things are production facilities. So our coastal zone is where we have an enormous amount of oil and gas energy infrastructure. Now I'm going to go to Katrina. What I'm doing here is I'm running a model run that we produced before landfall, and we use this to try and help educate folk or warn them. And you're going to see a very bright color developing in this area, and this is what we call the funnel. And what we have here was to aid economic development. the development or the building or construction of a navigation channel from the heart of the city out to the Gulf of Mexico, a 76-mile channel that in essence became a conduit for surge that could bypass the wetlands, and I'll show you more about that. Now what you'll see here is that there is some flooding in the city. This is what we predicted, and that was from overtopping of the levees being not high enough in many locations for the surge. Now, I'm glad Mark Steffstein's here because we worked together on the Saturday night to put together this graphic, which the Times-Picayune newspaper had in their Sunday morning edition. And I often hear, one of the myths I often hear is, oh, the people in New Orleans should have got out, it's their own fault. Well, we now know that 92% of the residents of Greater New Orleans got out, and we believe from anecdotal data that this image and the reports in the Times-Picayune and on the local TV stations really galvanized people to leave. Our public opinion surveys showed that only 68% would leave before Katrina, and we achieved 92. And it's for that reason that the death toll was so low. Now, what was interesting to us is that the three bowls, and you'll see one here, the Metro Bowl, Orleans East, and St. Bernard, the water level in each bowl was different, and in fact, the highest elevated area had the highest water, and that's the 11.5 feet, and the lowest elevated area, that's with the minus 1.5 feet, is an area that's 6 feet below sea level on average. So what it was telling us was whether you flooded and how badly you flooded depended not on your elevation, it depended on the quality of the protection that surrounded your bowl, the levees and the flood walls. Now, I've heard this so many times, oh, it's a natural disaster. Katrina in New Orleans was a man-made catastrophe with a hurricane trigger. And I think we hurt all the efforts to get money out of the Congress is when we try and sell Katrina in New Orleans as a natural disaster. It was a natural disaster in Mississippi, yes. But I think we need to be very clear about that. How did we get there? I'm not going into a whole lot of detail. We've spoken a little bit about the 65 Flood Control Act. I spoke about this navigation channel, Hurricane Alley. I'll go back to it. And there were many problems with science, designs, and geotechnical problems. And Jerry referred to some of those in his first presentation. I do want to draw your attention to one of the breaches, though, to give you an idea of how simple some of the mistakes were. And this is the Mirabeau beach in London Avenue. And this is what it looked like after the storm. There was a blowout hole that was over 30 feet deep. And when you move further away, the thing you noticed was lots and lots of white, clean sand. You can see this is the top of a motor car. And I'll draw your attention to this hole in the roof. And that hole in the roof, that's where that family escaped from that house. They had water almost up to those holes. Where did that sand come from? Well, what we found out was beneath that flood wall system, there was 50 feet of sand. Now, that's an issue you can design for. But unfortunately, the guys who did the design at the time used a 1905 method to determine whether water would seep underneath the system during the storm, called the Lane's Creep method. It was developed by the British in India for dams. And what they forgot to do was to recognize that the sand, this beach sand, is a very good conduit to move water, especially under pressure. So this was a back-of-the-envelope type calculation I did when I was standing there in the field. And you can work out if the surge is at 10.5 feet, the pressure on the top of the sand is 1,280 pounds per square foot. That's been transferred over here where there's no water. As an uplift pressure, what's keeping it down is the weight of the soil, and that was 660 pounds per square foot. The net result was the factor of safety was 0.5. This thing was going to fail. And it failed in many locations, and there were other areas where it almost failed. Now, this could have been picked up, and this is one of the things that I keep pushing, if there had been independent review of the designs. The Corps of Engineers tends to be, and I hate to say this, a closed shop. Before Katrina, we tried to get some of this data because I had seen levee walls that had big bows in them, but we couldn't get it. Now, obviously, we have. I also want to now look at this whole issue of the funnel and this navigation channel and levee overtopping. I was asked by some attorneys who filed a suit against the federal government over the flooding in Katrina to head up their science team. And we got experts from within the US, and we got a lot of fellows from the Delft University in the Netherlands on board. And the key thing was, you cannot sue the federal government over a levee failure, but you can sue them if a navigation channel contributes to the flooding. Private citizens had warned since 1958 about this, and certainly we had warned before Katrina. When you looked at the levees that bounded this navigation channel, and it's called the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, or as we refer to it, Mr. Go, the levees showed a lot of evidence of wave erosion that had been destroyed by waves. So working with the Dutch, we set up a number of models, and one of them was a wave model. And what we could show was the Mr. Go channel, because it had not been maintained. It was originally designed at 650 feet wide. It had expanded to 3,000 feet wide. That extra width at the height of the storm allowed waves that were developing in this area called Lake Bourne. They got knocked down a little bit as they crossed the wetlands to reform. And they reformed to the point, as I'll show you shortly, that they could chew up the levees. When we took out Mr. Go, the wave heights were exactly 1/2 of what occurred during Katrina. Now, many of you have heard of Bob B. from the University of Berkeley in California, and he was involved in looking at the erosion of these. And what he could show was, under the Katrina conditions, so I've lost my cursor, most of the levees, and this is the erosion line, would have failed by 5:30 or 6 in the morning. That's before landfall. If there hadn't been a Mr. Go, those levees wouldn't have failed. So that's one way to introduce water, is the waves destroy the levees. And unfortunately, this had been pointed out to the Corps. They had actually addressed it in their design documents, but it based their calculations on the fact that there were very healthy wetlands. The next thing was, did this Mr. Go channel contribute to the conveyance of surge into the city? So for this, we used one of the Dutch models. And very quickly, I want to draw your attention. Oh, lost my cursor again. The cross-section reach 1, and that's the channel that goes directly into the city, right in the funnel. And then cross-section reach 2, that's the canal that's coming up, the section of the channel that's coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. And if you notice in the panel at 8 p.m., scenario 1 is what happened during Katrina. And that little channel, the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, was carrying 430,000 cubic feet per second. That's half of what this river has in it today. This is the Ohio River in flood, for those who know it. It's a huge amount of water. If there had been no Mr. Go, it would have been down at 157,000. The contribution coming from the Gulf of Mexico via this Reach 2, that is, it is bypassing the wetlands because you have this open hose pipe connecting the Gulf, was almost half of that. If there had been no Mr. Go, it would have been significantly less. So what does this mean in terms of levee overtopping? The blue line shows you with time on the bottom axis the overtopping rate, and if you look at the very top here, the total is 302,000 cubic feet per linear foot for the duration of the storm, overtopping the levees, and that's into this part of the city. With no Mr. Go, it would have been far less. It would have been 61,000, a 50-fold decrease. What Bob B. and some of the others, and certainly some of my calculations have shown, if we didn't have the Mr. Go, even though there would have been levee overtopping, there wouldn't have been levee failures. So yes, the overtopping contributed, but the overtopping was because of a navigation channel, and it gets us back to this thing. We don't treat things as a system. We treat them as a series of projects. Now, this is very chilling. This is a model run of St. Bernard, and you're going to see at about 5:30 the levees blowing out. And I want you to see how quickly the water rises. So initially a little bit of blue, that's the rainfall. This is about 3 in the morning, and we'll see a little bit building up, building up. This area here is a wetland between the channel and the built environment of St. Bernard. And now you see the levee suddenly failing, as well as those in the lower 9th Ward. They reach the local levee, they just overtop it. And down in this area, people told me that the water rose 10 feet in half an hour. How do you escape that? So this is unfortunately some of the realities. Those of you who've been to the lower 9th, some of you had asked me to give you a picture. This is what the breach looked like when we had 18 feet of water blow through here during Katrina. Now, where are we today? The red shows the coastal wetlands that are going to be lost. According to this panel, by 2040, it's now been brought to about 2020. And you'll notice that the red is bounded by straight lines. And those are either predicted levees or existing levees, and there are many of these funnels. Here's one over here, and there's a whole series associated with this. So we right now are heading into an even more dangerous situation. In 2004, a year before Katrina, we had an exercise with the federal government to try and educate everybody as to what was going to happen. The Hurricane PAM exercise, and I'm going to use this for a number of reasons. The arrows are the wind vectors. You see in the eye come in over the coast, and it passes west of the city, and the whole city goes underwater without a levee failing. Okay. Now, contrary to what the Corps says, we believe this is a 1 in 32 event, 32-year event, and I'll get into that in a little while. If we look at it again, I'm going to start the model because there's a very important aspect of this that needs to be fully appreciated as we talk about Katrina and what it was. Now I'm going to stop the model at that point. And you'll see the eye hasn't made landfall, but we've got that purple dome of water, and that's building up against the wonderful river levees that we have. But those river levees form a reservoir, they form a wall, and we develop a dome of water. And during Katrina, the eye went straight from where you see it there over the dome, and it picked up that dome and it drove that dome into Mississippi. So when we try and say, oh, Katrina had these amazing, super, unheard of before surges, everybody is talking about what happened in Mississippi, and by the Corps of Engineers' own experts, at least 25% of the height of the water in Mississippi was created by the levee systems in Louisiana. So really, you have to be very careful when people try to say Katrina was a 1 in 200 year, even some reports 1 in 400 year storm. Katrina was a storm that missed New Orleans by 35 miles, and if you go through the data, has a frequency of once every 32 years of a storm like this impacting Louisiana. Now I'm going to show you another model run we did to try and give the governors at the time a better understanding. This is a storm similar to Katrina. It's making landfall in the central part of the coast, and right here on the right you will see that the part of New Orleans on the other side of the river is going underwater. But so is the communities of Morgan City, Homer, Berwick, and it even gets into parts of New Iberia. So this whole of Louisiana, coastal Louisiana, is super susceptible. This is our absolute best protection, our cypress swamps. But unfortunately, through saltwater intrusion and mismanagement, we have destroyed thousands upon thousands of acres. When the surge seas hits this, these trees don't fall down. It literally has to jump around the trees from tree to tree to tree. There's 3 important aspects of a cypress swamp. Number 1, it adds friction to the surge, so it knocks the surge down. Our new data would suggest that that is as good as 3 feet per mile, and maybe even better. The second thing is it separates the wind from the water. So you lose the driving force to move the water forward. And the third important thing is if there are any waves, it totally absorbs the wave energy. So this is the sort of thing we really need to be encouraging to come in. Now, we've proposed from the LSU Hurricane Center a plan. I'm not going to go into much detail, but the bottom line is We cannot afford to inhabit all of our coastal zone. We cannot afford to give everybody so-called Category 5 protection. We are going to have to retreat from the coast. And the way you do that, and it's not in any of the planning efforts right now, is compensation. You buy easements on the properties, or you pay to move people, or you pay to retool them to catch different fish, because when you start diversions, you're going to change the fishery. Conceptually, what we need is, we used to have very extensive barrier islands on our coast. The barrier islands trip up the surge, but most importantly, they filter out the waves that are coming from offshore, that are long period waves that are very dangerous. So we need barrier islands. We need the barrier islands because they protect our wetlands. We need our wetlands because they protect our levee systems, and we need our levee systems because they protect us. We're in a situation where we don't have enough sediment. So we've really got to think about what we do, and our suggestion is we need to be creating wetlands to protect our levees. And we need to be creating barrier islands to protect those wetlands to protect our levees. So a very different change. And there's a big argument going in Louisiana right now, because there are some academics who are stuck on, we've got to keep the ecology, we've got to keep it the way it is. It's too late for that. Sea level rise over the last 100 years in Louisiana has been 3 feet per century. It's now predicted to be 6 feet per century. So you can imagine how difficult it's going to be to achieve what we really hope. There's also examples of being able to use some of the Dutch structures. We have real problems with soft soils, but we do have good foundation material down 100-odd feet. And for those who've never seen these eastern shelled gates, this is a human being for scale. Now, we do have still some sediment in the Mississippi River, and this is a project we've proposed, and as Jerry showed you earlier, it's been looked at by others. But what we're going to do is, in the central part of Louisiana, the mouth of the Atchafalaya River, and also at a man-made cut, a diversion from the Atchafalaya River, we have 2 deltas. And one of them, being the Wax Lake, is growing on its own. It just keeps growing and growing and growing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of those deltas, and I'm going to plug it down south of New Orleans, and I'm going to run Katrina, and we're going to look at the surge. And what we see in this time step is, with Katrina, we got 13 feet of water, but the same with this new delta, 7 feet. We can knock 6 foot of surge off with one delta system. That is very significant, especially for Mississippi, because they are the ones who suffer from some of our levee enhancement. I'm almost there. Our barrier islands, they're very easy to restore. We got sand offshore. I'm going to run a model here. I'm just going to make the islands a little bit higher and a little wider. And important for the community of Homer, we see with this scenario, they would have got 11 feet with the barrier islands down to 9 feet. The difference is they wouldn't have flooded. So there's some real values. Now, unfortunately, there's still a major disconnect between science and policy. At the present time, the state of Louisiana is pushing a project that would push the levees seaward, or move them in some locations or even more seaward, and it's an area called Morganza to the Gulf. Geologically, it is about the worst place you could build a levee because it's sitting on top of an old Pleistocene valley, and the subsidence rate in that valley is 10 times higher than on the edges. It's 10 times higher than even here in New Orleans. This is, I've tried to superimpose one of the, this is an earlier showing of a plan. You can see pushing it seawards. Very, very organic soils, very soft substrate, very deep if you want to put in pilings. So we've really, this is a project that's been pushed so hard. Some of us have lost our jobs over it. But it's a case of policy decision makers not being aware of the science or not willing to listen to it. Now, what's happening here is a national problem. New Orleans is just the first, and the question we ask ourselves is, do we as a nation have the will or the money? This is a memorial to the in lower Ninth Ward, and I was most touched they quoted me. We've seen the money being spent on bailouts, bailouts, bailouts. But really, the money for coastal Louisiana has never appeared, and nor has the compensation for those 150,000 families who lost everything overnight. But there is something on the horizon. And that is, I go back to this Mr. Go litigation. And it's been decided right now the judge is going to make his ruling. Many of us feel he's going to rule for the plaintiffs. That means the federal government could be forced to come up with $100 billion or maybe more in terms of compensation and so on. What we're hoping is that this will force Congress to come up with a plan to help Louisiana. And one last thing, a suit has been filed and it's moving forward where some lawyers and plaintiffs are now claiming that the energy companies have enhanced global warming and global warming enhanced Katrina. So that could be an interesting development. So the conclusions are, we've got to be aware of the changes in rivers, sediment loads with time. We've got to recognize that we're going to have to develop new technologies. We're going to have both retreat and defense. And many of us ask, we as the nation have the ability to do that. And I always remember, I always ask myself at this point, the 1,282 people who died in Katrina, what would they be saying right now if they were sitting in this room? And with that, I thank you for your time.